It always starts with a dare, doesn't it? Or at least a terrible idea masquerading as an adventure. Right in the heart of our sprawling, modernized city, suffocated by glass skyscrapers and the relentless hum of traffic, sits the old fort. It's a crumbling monolith of black basalt and forgotten history, a relic from a time when blood and steel dictated the borders. I'd walked past it 100 times in the daylight, always feeling a vague sense of unease, but I'd never felt the urge to cross its threshold. That was until Leo called. It was a Tuesday evening, the kind of mundane, drizzly evening that begs for the comfort of a warm couch. But Leo, my oldest friend, and a man pathologically incapable of sitting still, had other plans. He'd read an article about the fort's inner sanctum and decided we needed to see it. When I suggested we go on a sunny Saturday afternoon, he scoffed. "Artie, you don't visit a 400-year-old graveyard in the daylight. That's like watching a horror movie with the lights on. We go tonight, midnight. We need to experience the full atmosphere." My gut immediately tied itself into a cold, tight knot. A primal, visceral hesitation washed over me. I tried to argue, bringing up the trespassing laws, the potential for muggers, the sheer stupidity of the idea. But Leo was relentless, wearing down my defenses with a barrage of mockery and pleading. Against my better judgment, and silencing that screaming instinct in the back of my head, I agreed. I told myself it was just a pile of old rocks. I had no idea how wrong I was. The drive through the city was an exercise in forced bravado. The rain had stopped, leaving the asphalt slick and reflective under the harsh glare of the orange streetlights. The deeper we drove into the old quarter, the more the modern city seemed to peel away. The towering glass facades gave way to narrow colonial-era streets, and the ambient noise of the metropolis faded into a heavy, oppressive silence. Leo was trying to keep the mood light. He had brought a giant bag of cheap artificial cheese puffs and was loudly crunching on them, blasting an upbeat indie rock playlist from the car speakers. But the energy was entirely artificial. I could see the rigid posture of his shoulders, the way his eyes darted to the dark alleyways we passed. My own hands were gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles were bone white. Every time I glanced in the rearview mirror, I expected to see something sitting in the back seat. The nervous excitement that usually accompanied our urban explorations had completely evaporated, replaced by a suffocating dread. The scent of the stale cheese puffs mixed with the damp, earthy smell of the old city coming through the vents. Finally, the narrow street opened up, and there it was. The old fort loomed ahead of us against the starless sky, a jagged black silhouette that seemed to absorb the light around it. The engine idled, and for a long moment neither of us said a word. The indie music sounded horribly out of place. We parked a block away, the crunch of gravel beneath our boots sounding obscenely loud in the dead air. We approached the main entrance, massive, rusted iron gates that looked heavy enough to withstand a siege engine. To our surprise, a single flickering fluorescent bulb illuminated a small, dilapidated security booth just inside the perimeter. Sitting inside, hunched over a tiny space heater, was a lone guard. He looked as ancient as the stones themselves. His uniform was faded and frayed at the collar, and the deep lines etched into his face spoke of years spent awake in the dark. I tapped on the scratched plexiglass window. He didn't jump. He just slowly turned his head, his eyes dull and exhausted. He slid the glass an inch open. "Fort's closed. No entry after dark," he rasped. His voice was weary, tired, scraped hollow like a man who had repeated those words 1,000 times and knew they were the only thing keeping the world sane. "We just want to take a quick look around," Leo said, pulling a crisp $50 bill from his wallet and sliding it toward the gap. 5 minutes, a photography project for college." The guard looked at the money, then up at Leo, and finally at us. He didn't look angry. He looked profoundly sad. "The rules aren't here to protect the fort from you boys," he said softly. The guard didn't touch the money at first. He just stared at us, his rheumy eyes calculating our stubbornness. I was secretly praying he would stand firm, that he would yell at us and threaten to call the police so I could drag Leo back to the car with a clear conscience, but Leo pressed the bill closer. With a sigh that seemed to deflate his entire chest, the guard reached out a trembling, calloused hand and snatched the bill. He pulled a heavy ring of iron keys from his belt and stepped out of the booth. The cold air seemed to bite him. As he fit a massive antique key into the padlock, he paused, not looking at us, speaking to the rusted iron. "Stay to the outer walls," the guard warned, his weary voice barely a whisper above the wind. "Don't go down into the lower terraces, and if you hear the gravel crunching when you're not moving, don't turn around to look, just walk back." The heavy padlock clicked with a sickening thud. He pushed the small pedestrian gate just open enough for us to squeeze through. The metal screamed in protest, a long, high-pitched screech that echoed into the black abyss of the ruins. We stepped through. As the gate clanged shut behind us, locking us in, the ambient noise of the city completely vanished. It was as if we had stepped into a vacuum. There is a specific kind of darkness that belongs to ancient places. It's not just an absence of light. It feels heavy, almost tangible, like a thick liquid pressing against your skin. We turned our phone flashlights on, but the beams seemed weak, swallowed up by the sheer scale of the basalt walls. The crunch of the loose gravel beneath our boots was deafening. Every step we took echoed off the stone corridors, sounding like a small army marching in unison. We wandered deeper, passing under archways that had stood for centuries. The moonlight, breaking through the ragged clouds, filtered down through the collapsed roofs. It painted the ruins in stark, ghostly silver and deep, impenetrable black. The shadows were the worst part. The jagged, ruined walls cast long, distorted silhouettes that stretched across the ground. In the corner of my eye, the shadows looked like reaching limbs, long skeletal arms grasping at our ankles as we walked past. I kept my head down, trying to focus solely on the circle of light from my phone, my breath catching in my throat every time the wind whistled through the arrow slits. Leo was unusually quiet, the bravado completely stripped away. We were intruders here, and the fort knew it.
We had lost our sense of direction entirely. What was supposed to be a 10-minute walk along the perimeter had turned into a disorienting maze. We took a left turn through a particularly narrow, crumbling passageway and suddenly found ourselves stepping out of the enclosed walls and into a wide, open space. It was a hidden courtyard, sunken into the earth. The air here was entirely still, devoid of the wind that had been whistling through the upper levels. As I swept my flashlight across the space, the beam caught rows and rows of stone markers. They were graves, small, uniform, weathered down to rounded nubs by centuries of rain. This was the final resting place of the fallen fighters, the foot soldiers whose names hadn't made it into the history books. The atmosphere shifted instantly. It wasn't just the spooky ambiance of old ruins anymore. It felt like we had walked into a crowded room where everyone had suddenly stopped talking to stare at us. The silence was heavy, expectant. I wanted to leave immediately, the guard's warning ringing in my ears about the lower terraces. But Leo, driven by some morbid fascination, had already stepped off the stone path and was walking among the markers, brushing the dead vines away from the ancient stone. "Artie, come look at this," Leo called out. His voice was hushed, lacking its usual boom. I didn't want to. My legs felt like lead, but I forced myself to walk over to where he was standing near the far end of the courtyard. Apart from the neat military rows of the other graves, there was one singular tomb set apart in a shadowed alcove. It was much larger, a heavy, solid slab of granite that looked entirely out of place among the sandstone markers. It was covered in a thick layer of lichen and centuries of grime. I knelt down beside Leo, the damp cold of the earth seeping instantly through the knees of my jeans. Leo was using the sleeve of his jacket to furiously rub away the dirt from the top of the slab. "There's no name," he whispered, shining his light directly onto the carved indentation. The letters were deep, crude, as if they had been chiseled in a frantic hurry. I leaned in, tracing the deep grooves with my eyes. The inscription didn't list a rank or a date of birth or a family lineage. It bore only a chilling, solitary title: the Headless Man. As soon as I read the words, the world around us fundamentally changed. It started with the scent. There was no breeze, yet the stagnant, earthy smell of the courtyard was suddenly overwhelmed by an odor that made my stomach heave. It was cloyingly sweet, like a concentrated burst of crushed jasmine flowers mixed with the sickly scent of rotting fruit left in the sun. In the local folklore, my grandmother used to whisper about this: the sudden, unnatural floral sense, the perfume of the dead. It was the warning sign of a manifestation. Then came the cold. It wasn't a drop in the weather. It was an aggressive, localized freezing that felt like stepping into an industrial meat locker. The ambient heat was sucked from my body in a terrifying instant. I exhaled, and a thick cloud of white vapor plumed from my lips into the flashlight beam. My heart began to hammer a frantic rhythm against my ribs. The legends I had ignored all my life came flooding back, tales of the decapitated general who wandered the fort looking for his stolen skull, slaughtering anyone who trespassed on his resting place. The gravel behind us shifted. Crunch, crunch. It was slow, deliberate, the sound of something impossibly heavy taking a step. Leo froze, completely paralyzed. The flashlight slipped from his numb fingers and clattered onto the stone slab, rolling so the beam pointed upward into the alcove behind the grave. I didn't want to look. Every survival instinct screamed at me to close my eyes, but I was compelled by a sheer, morbid terror. I slowly followed the beam of light upwards. Standing in the alcove, eclipsing the moonlight, was a shadow. But it wasn't flat against the wall. It was three-dimensional, a towering mass of absolute darkness that seemed to swallow the light around it. It was broad-shouldered, draped in something ragged and heavy, and where the neck should have met the head, there was nothing, just a jagged, empty space against the faint glow of the night sky. The shadow shifted, and the temperature plummeted further. The overwhelming smell of rotting sweetness filled my nose until I couldn't breathe. "Run!" I choked out. The paralysis broke. I grabbed Leo by the collar of his jacket and hauled him backward. We didn't care about the noise anymore. We scrambled over the slick stones, our boots slipping on the wet grass. We blindly sprinted back into the labyrinth of corridors, the echoing sound of our own frantic footsteps masking whatever might have been pursuing us. I didn't look back. I just ran until my lungs burned, navigating by pure adrenaline through the grasping shadows. We burst out of the narrow corridor and saw the flickering fluorescent light of the guard's booth in the distance, like a lighthouse in a storm. We hit the iron gates at a full sprint, gripping the cold metal, gasping for air, demanding to be let out. The guard didn't look surprised. He didn't ask what happened. He just moved with agonizing slowness, unlocked the pedestrian gate, and let us spill out onto the safe, solid concrete of the modern city. As I bent over, hands on my knees, trying to shake, the guard looked down at me. His weary eyes held a deep, terrible sympathy. "I told you to stay on the outer walls," he said softly. What is that thing?" Leo stammered, his face devoid of color. The guard shook his head, returning to his tiny booth and locking the door behind him. "I don't know," he confessed, his voice muffled through the glass. "But sometimes they come all the way to the gate. I just sit here and listen to the heavy footsteps and the desperate knocking on my door until the sun comes up." It's been 6 weeks since that night. I haven't spoken to Leo. Neither of us wants to acknowledge what we saw. But the trauma has woven itself into my daily life. Even now, in the safety of my high-rise apartment, whenever the sun dips below the horizon, I feel a phantom, bone-deep chill creep up my spine. The sweet smell of my neighbor's jasmine plant makes me nauseous, and I can no longer look out my window toward the center of the city, because even from miles away, the silhouette of the old fort sits there waiting, and my heart begins to race, wondering if the Headless Man is still walking the perimeter, looking for the gate.